Okay, so for this class, we're going to be talking about the executive branch and the presidency. This is somewhat of a longer course. It'll basically be divided into, or class, I mean, it'll basically be divided into two parts. Maybe you want to pause after the first part, or you can really pause at any point. Obviously, that's one of the joys of an asynchronous class such as this. But there are basically two things I want to explore. One, which I think is very important, is this idea of whether or not Donald Trump represents some sort of fascist resurgence in the United States, whether or not American political order in the US is increasingly becoming, more blatantly authoritarian, which will basically make up the first part of the class. The second part will be more geared towards the idea or explore the idea of presidential cycles, which was captured in the assigned readings for this course. Both of which are very important, but I think it's important to respond to this, since this seems to be an ongoing debate whether or not Trump administration represents fascism. So let's briefly overlook or overview some of the things that have happened during the Trump administration. Obviously, some things I've already covered, so you can go back to previous lectures for that. But if we survey sort of the first 100 days of the Trump administration, basically up until the end of April, and a few things have happened since then, of course. Trump has assigned executive orders attacking free speech, undermining constitutional protections, expanding military and executive powers, and launching an assault on immigrants and political opponents. Seems to be, pretty explicit authoritarianism there. This includes deportation of legal residents under the Alien Enemies Act, not just undocumented immigrants, but also people who are legally residing here in the United States. Of course, the most high-profile example of this so far is Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who was deported to a torture prison in El Salvador, violating court order and his right to a hearing. You also have the unlawful detention of students for protected speech, ICE officers detaining people for exercising First Amendment rights, deporting U.S. Citizens, children in this case, to Honduras, detaining hundreds of migrants in Florida as part of a mass roundup plan, of course, elsewhere as well. These seem to be, fairly starkly authoritarian things. Again, the Trump administration has threatened mass deportations of U.S. citizens, which he refers to as homegrowns, launched an unprecedented attack on the judiciary, including the arrest of Judge Hannah Dugan, signed executive orders targeting sanctuary cities, including deploying the military, as we've seen in Los Angeles, and bolstering protections for police accused of violence and murder. The regime has also targeted universities, attempting to rewrite curricula, purge faculty and students under the banner of combating anti-Semitism. The first 100 days also saw major social counter-revolutionary action, tens of thousands of federal workers fired, dismantling of public agencies, slashing of corporate environmental regulations, and of course, cuts to the social safety net, which have already been gone through decades of cuts prior to this. The Trump administration's destruction of public health and education, anti-vaccine campaign led by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., firing over 20,000 public health workers and discouraging vaccination efforts, leading to the resurgence of diseases. Of course, efforts to privatize public education and release hundreds of climate researchers as well. One of the most noteworthy instances of Trump or the Trump administration sort of, shedding seemingly many of the constitutional checks and balances, which are meant to restrain the power of the executive, is this Trump versus Casa Supreme Court case. In a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court sided with the Trump administration, Trump v. Casa. So, of course, many of Trump's attacks on constitutional rights and due process has been aided by the Supreme Court, even if he's been restrained by lower courts. For the most part, has been aided in these attempts by the Supreme Court as well. And the federal court's ability to issue universal injunctions, even against unconstitutional government actions. The ruling enables the government to prepare to enforce Trump's executive order, eliminating birthright citizenship, despite the 14th Amendment clearly guaranteeing it. As a consequence of this ruling, the judiciary is stripped of its ability to block unconstitutional executive orders nationwide. Federal judges are now restricted to granting relief only to the plaintiffs before them, not the public at large. So what this means basically is that if the administration does something illegal and the court stops in to intervene or to block it, it only applies to those people who are, directly the recipients of this sort of executive action. So, for example, if the Trump administration tries to deport people who are U.S. Citizens and a court stops it, it only basically refers to the people, the specific plaintiffs, not to the public at large. So the administration is sort of free to continue doing things like this, which of course creates an enormous obstacle on the part of people. You would have to then be able to basically to challenge government power, be able to afford a lawsuit and things like that, which is obviously not easily done. Not to mention it would take a significant amount of time. Justice Sotomayor in her dissent called the order patently unconstitutional and compared the ruling to the Dred Scott decision that denied citizenship to African Americans. The decision suggests basic constitutional rights may only apply to litigants, again, to the parties in a lawsuit, not universally, which is a major erosion of, again, checks and balances against the use of executive power. This opens the door for Trump or future presidents to ban protests and strikes, arrest political dissidents, censor the press, strip basic democratic rights without fear of court orders halting enforcement nationwide. Now, besides that, of course, you have to consider the larger context, the incompatibility of democratic rule with the concentration of wealth and endless imperialist wars. The extreme levels of wealth inequality that exist in the United States are just simply incompatible with a democratic form of government. I mean, that is a glaring contradiction, which is kind of staring everybody in the face, yet a lot of people tend to ignore it or pretend that somehow a democracy can, continue even in the face of this massive wealth concentration, which has, of course, gone on for some time now. The U.S. continues to maintain, continues war to maintain its global hegemony or rule with threats of annexation and continued support for the Gaza genocide as well. Now, the Democratic Party, for its part, has not really significantly opposed Trump's attempts to erect a kind of presidential dictatorship, but has in some ways facilitated it. Democrats passed Trump's spending bill to avoid a shutdown and pledge cooperation with him, especially with his tariffs. Even figures like Bernie Sanders have signaled a willingness to work with Trump on this issue. House Democratic leadership led a majority of Democrats in voting down a resolution to impeach Trump for launching an unprovoked illegal attack on Iran without congressional authorization. Besides that, the party's focus on identity politics and war, arguably the Democrats are as big of, if not a bigger warmongering party than the Republicans now, has failed to address workers' suffering. So for decades now, the Democratic Party has seemingly ceased to do anything to significantly fight for or to reverse the erosion of living standards for workers in this country, instead focusing on cultural and symbolic issues, issues of identity and representation, while basically leaving the vast majority of the population in the lurch, basically. So this leads to a fairly obvious question: is Trump fascist? Now, this word is thrown around a lot. Obviously, most people don't really have a precise understanding of what it means. I think you can make a pretty good argument that it does represent something like that, at least a movement towards something like that. And this is, again, not an ongoing debate that happens among the left in this country. Liberals often portray Trump as fascist, and some on the farther left argue that that's an exaggeration. But there are also people on the far left that also share this idea that Trump is fascist as well. So how do you really understand this term? I think there's a difference between a more materialistically grounded notion of fascism, what comes out of Marxist theory, and this more of a sort of an academic definition of fascism, which I think kind of misses the point to a large extent. So fascism in its classic 20th century form is a counter-revolutionary mass movement. This is sort of what you get out of Marxist theory. It emerges in periods of acute capitalist crisis when the ruling class can no longer govern in the usual way. The working class threatens to assert itself politically. Now, one of the biggest objections to the idea that Trump represents fascism is that there is no real radical workers' movement in the United States, and certainly not a revolutionary workers' movement. That may be true. So, for instance, when you look back on historical examples where fascism has emerged, Italy and Germany, most of, especially, these were countries which did have a revolutionary workers' movement, the one which failed to, take power and then was sort of, crushed in the backlash against it. And in the absence of something like that here in the United States, it'd be argued that essentially fascism would be an unnecessary thing. The more sort of normal means of political and social control in so-called bourgeois democratic political forms and institutions would be enough to maintain control. Now, I think there is a way that you can respond to this argument, even in the absence of a radical workers' movement here in the United States. One is that could this be considered a kind of preemptive strike? In other words, while there may not be a radical workers' movement now in the United States, there does seem to be some emerging signs of one starting to form. So, is the imposition of fascism in the United States a preemptive move to sort of, prevent the emergence of a radical workers' movement? That seems to make sense. Certainly seems plausible. It also takes a longer, historical view of things, right? The last time you saw even anything even resembling a radicals worker movement in the United States was the 1930s, maybe arguably in the 1960s as well. But in the 1930s, reforms were made. This is what also we'll sort of cover in the later part of the class when we talk about the New Deal and the New Deal presidential cycle. But there's a sense now that maybe the ruling class, the capitalist class, doesn't want to do that. The idea being that we made some kind of reforms in the 1930s with workers, and things sort of escalated from there. So rather than do that again, we'll just crush them basically and impose fascism on them. So this idea of a kind of preemptive strike, I think, is a plausible explanation, at least. And also, the lack of a radical workers' movement in the United States, tends to overlook the long history of socialist and anarchist repression here in the United States. So, for example, in the article that I wrote from the beginning of class, within the footnotes of the article, there's a reference to the U.S. Presidential Commission on Violence in the 1960s. And that commission, among the many panels that were called, one panel was devoted to labor issues in the United States. And that panel concluded that the United States had the most violent labor struggles of any capitalist country, basically. So you have to, like I said, keep into account that there's been a very long history of socialist repression in the United States. Big part of the reason why we don't have a radical workers' movement in this country. So if fascism is about crushing workers' resistance, well, they've already kind of crushed workers' resistance in this country. So to argue that there's no need to do that seems a bit strange when in fact they've already kind of done it. And like I said, now with the signs of maybe an emerging wave of radicalism here in the United States, the rationale is to kind of impose a sort of more authoritarian form of control before that can happen. To me, that seems a perfectly reasonable response to this idea that, well, because there's no radical workers movement in this country, there can't be fascism in this country. So that's one point. The other is that, even if you reject that argument, I mean, you're still left with Sheldon Wolin's idea of inverted totalitarianism, which is not usually addressed at all. Which is that you have this sort of illusion of democracy in this country, even though power is basically concentrated at the top. And most people who deny that Trump is, fascist don't even respond to that argument at all. So you're still left with that. I think a critical question kind of comes out of this, which is that, in the 20 or so years since Wolin coined this term and this idea, are we seeing a sort of a further evolution of it? In other words, is the illusion of democracy unraveling in this country? Are we in fact sort of moving from that democratic facade or that mask which conceals the concentration of power? Is that mask sort of falling down to a certain extent, or slipping to a certain extent, and we're sort of transitioning into a more sort of overt, explicit form of authoritarianism? I think that's a plausible thing to consider. Again, especially in light of an ongoing capitalist crisis, the further erosion. I mean, in other words, have things gotten worse basically in the 20 years since Wolin wrote this? Yeah, it pretty much has. So I think that would be another point to inject here, is that people who warn of fascism in the United States, I think in many ways it's sort of a warning call, right? It's sort of saying, well, maybe if we're not there yet, we're kind of heading down this road. And to that I would add, it's well, yeah, I mean, what do you expect people to do? Are we just supposed to sit and wait for there to be full blown fascism, before anything is done, basically? And again, I mean, where are we now 20 years later? Are we further down the road towards fascism? Are we in the same place? Have we gone backwards from that? I don't think so. I think, if anything, we are further down the road now than we were 20 years ago. So important things to keep in mind. Now, again, from a Marxist point of view, as Marxist theorists like Trotsky and Pannekoek have argued, who are very different in their own right, fascism mobilizes the enraged petty bourgeoisie, the little bourgeoisie, the small business owners, and what is known as the lumpen proletariat. This is basically a part of the workforce that is not regularly employed, not a part of the regular workforce. They are either unemployed, underemployed, criminals in some cases, and this group within society, it's very hard to characterize the lumpen proletariat to some extent, and various people have different stances on them as well. Some later Marxist thinkers see a more potentially positive role, even. But from a sort of more orthodox Marxist point of view, the lumpen proletariat plays a fairly reactionary role in society. These sort of made up the foot soldiers, which later made up the fascist paramilitary groups like the Black Shirts in Italy, Hitler's Brown Shirts, and their modern day analogs, groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, who are loyal to Trump. These are like the thugs basically that go around beating up opposition and things like that. We saw these people play their role on January 6th, for example. So what Marxist theorists do is they focus more on the class component of fascism, which a lot of academics who talk about fascism don't do. And they look at kind of the political role that fascism plays, which again is to sort of restore the power of capital over the working class. As it says here, it functions to crush working class organizations, dismantle democracy, and preserve capitalist property relations. Though it draws support from lower and middle classes, it serves monopoly capital, creating a bureaucratized, militarized dictatorship. So, again, so looking at the class component of it, do you see those sort of class formations in operation here with Trump? Yes, you do. I mean, Trump's base of support basically draws from the same social classes that have historically supported fascist movements in the past. To compare the lumpen of the 1920s and the 1930s, I've created a little table here. You can see the commonalities. Are they made up of declassed or redundant men? Again, men who don't have a sort of a stable place in society. Many of them with a law enforcement or military background as well, especially in the fascist era after World War I in Italy and Germany. Saw that quite often. Do they engage in street violence? Yes. Do they have a sort of ideology of militant Nationalism, yes. Do they reject socialism? Yes. Are they have an attraction to hierarchy and uniforms? Yes, for the most part. Are they seen as defenders of the nation by elites? Yes, in most cases. So there are certainly a lot of parallels between the these groups known as, as the black shirts and the brown shirts in Germany and Italy in the 1920s and 1930s, and these modern day groups like the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers as well. But besides that, fascism doesn't just function in terms of brute force and power, right? It's a little more sophisticated than that even. So one theorist who really weighs in on this issue is the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, who was imprisoned by um, Mussolini for about 10 years before he died, basically in prison in the late 1930s. So for Gramsci, fascism isn't just a tool of class domination and doesn't just rely on brute force. In other words, it builds what he calls ideological hegemony, or sometimes referred to as cultural hegemony, which is basically consent to domination. It's a way of making domination appear as if it's normal and natural, basically. How do you get people to actually consent to their own domination, in other words? Now, Gramsci, it should also be added, early on kind of underestimated fascism. He thought it'd be more of a temporary phenomenon as well, much like a lot of current day Marxists tend to dismiss the threat of Trump. But Gramsci realized, too late, literally when he was already in prison, that this was a serious threat and one which was not just going to go away on its own. So by building what he calls hegemony, this allows fascism to wage a war of position, as he calls it, which is akin in many ways to trench warfare, restructuring society to prevent future revolutionary movement. So the analogy to trench warfare is interesting in that it's a slow moving incremental process. It's not, fascism doesn't just come in one sort of, grandiose moment where these people just, ride into the city and, kill everybody and take power. It's a much more gradual, yes, I mean, that might happen early on in some cases, but the way in which it's able to hold on to power and to consolidate power requires it to slowly basically take control of all aspects of, of society, basically. So it builds, again, a hegemonic consensus, a consensus that its rule is justified basically through control of media, education, religious institutions, and unions as well, which become basically taken over by fascists and essentially subordinate the working class to the fascist state. Now, in the United States, again, Sheldon Wolin has already talked about this. I mean, this kind of control is already evident, although it's not necessarily all under the direction of the state, but corporations play a very big role in controlling these institutions as well. Media, education, religion, unions, which are supposed to represent workers more often than not, seem to function as more of a kind of industrial police force in this country, policing workers, keeping them subordinate, weakening them so that they are basically still under the control of capitalists, basically. And you see this through the recurring strikes that happen, which end before they can really, gain any real traction or power or anything like that, and often are, isolated from other labor movements as well. So again, a war of maneuver, direct open confrontation with the state, an armed uprising, is not necessarily characteristic of how fascism works, or even how a revolutionary movement would take power as well. Gramsci introduces these terms to argue that socialists basically have to adopt these kinds of tactics as well. You're not going to necessarily take power through an armed uprising. That may have worked in Russia, that may have worked in some other examples, even after Gramsci, like Cuba, for example. But for the most part, in the most advanced capitalist societies, which have a very developed civil society, these different institutions, again, of education and media and other institutions, he advocates for, again, this kind of war of position, as he calls it, a slow struggle to build hegemony within civil society and shift ideological balance in favor of the working class. So he sort of sees where fascism succeeded and argues that socialists have to sort of adopt these kinds of tactics as well. They have to slowly sort of win workers over to their side through sort of infiltrating the different institutions within society, through the education institutions, through media and things like that. But it's a slow process. Gramsci also speaks of fascism as initiating what he calls a passive revolution, a top-down modernization of production through state intervention and corporative organization. These changes do not abolish capitalist profit, however, rather they intensify planning while preserving private appropriation. Now, in the case of Italy, this was particularly noteworthy in that Italy was considered an economically backwards or economically underdeveloped country at that point in time. Fascism was then as a way to sort of aggressively catch up to the more advanced capitalist countries of this time. But Trump, again, plays a sort of similar role, right? He's planning to bring all these jobs back to the United States, and he's going to re-industrialize the country and things like that. So you see a very similar class component supporting Trump as supported fascist movements. Again, ultimately in the service of big capital, which of course is also playing out with Trump as well. Trump's tax cuts and even the tariffs can be considered as a means to preserve American corporate monopolies, particularly in the technology sector and companies like Tesla, for example, which are threatened by foreign competition. When you turn to the ideology of fascist regimes like Italy and Germany, they tend to combine reactionary nationalism, America first, mythic histories, make America great again, traditional values, patriarchy, white nationalism in the case of the United States, homophobia, and visions of national rebirth as well. So again, all characteristics that you would see in Trump as well. Fascism reframes capitalist crisis as a cultural and moral decay caused by outsiders, traitors, internal enemies, Jews, communists, immigrants, feminists, etc. Its appeal is largely emotional, irrational, and aesthetic. It's based on spectacle and a false sense of unity through submission as well. So most, if not all, of these characteristics, again, you would see present within Trump as well. This hyperbolic appeal to nationalism, to a mythic golden age of the past, blaming scapegoats basically for the problems of this country. All commonalities here. Now, so that's Gramsci's approach, more or less. Now we can turn to other theorists as well. Now, some people might say, well, all you really need to do is look at, the class component of it and how it functions to, crush working class resistance in the interest of capital, and that's all you really need. And I can see that to a certain extent. But, a lot of people have weighed in on this question from various different perspectives. So let's look at a couple more. Another interesting approach to understanding fascism were the studies on the authoritarian personality done by a political thinker named Theodor Adorno, who was part of a group known as the Frankfurt School. This group of German intellectuals who fled Hitler's Germany, came to the United States. Adorno worked with a team of other psychiatrists and sociologists here. He himself was kind of more of a social theorist. But they did this large-scale study on what they call the authoritarian personality, which they say is a mindset marked by fear, submission to authority, and hostility toward the marginalized. They argue that it functions as a cultural, psychological response to modern alienation, offering comfort in rigid order, tradition, and fixed identity during times of crisis. This personality structure is not innate but shaped by the contradictions and anxieties of capitalist modernity. I also focus a lot, being grounded in psychoanalysis on parental relationships as well. Basically, overly strict parents tend to help, facilitate this kind of personality. But here you have sort of like a psychological approach, essentially, to fascism, a kind of personality type, which is, again, filled with paranoia, fear, both submissive to authority figures, but looking to dominate people or groups that they could perceive to be weaker than themselves. I don't think it's much of a stretch to sort of extend this not only to Trump himself, but to many people who are among his most diehard supporters. But we see that Trump is also losing lots of supporters now over this Epstein stuff. So that's an interesting thing to keep track of as well. So that's another point of view that you can look at, which I think is interesting. Some also locate the origins of fascism to imperialism and colonialism. Fascism is inseparable from imperialism and racial hierarchy. Both Nazi Germany and fascist Italy pursued expansionist projects rooted in racial superiority and Lebensraum, German word for living space, again, expanding outward. As Aimé Césaire argued, European fascism was the boomerang of colonial violence, the return of imperial methods to the imperial court. So the brutal, overt means of subjugating people in the colonies was later brought home and sort of implemented among the home populations of these countries. Another interesting, perspective to look at it from. So again, I think you can make a good argument in terms of the ideology of fascism, in terms of the psychological characteristics of fascism, and probably most importantly, again, in terms of the class components and sort of, the political function that fascism plays. Certainly many commonalities between fascist movements and Trump. I think you can go a little bit further, though. So some people say, well, Trump's not a fascist, he's an authoritarian. Well, what is the difference between the two? Now, authoritarianism is a term that's used often in political science, usually meant to distinguish itself from fascism or from totalitarianism, which the latter two terms are often associated with each other, fascism and totalitarianism. So the term authoritarianism has been used in political science for quite some time, but it became more prominent in the 20th century. What I would like to argue here is that maybe the difference between authoritarianism and fascism is not quite as significant as people would have you believe. That oftentimes when we talk about an authoritarian regime, it basically is a fascist regime. But for various reasons, American academics and American politicians don't like to view these regimes as being fascist. So I think the idea that Trump is not fascist, but he's authoritarian doesn't really make sense if we can actually find that these two terms basically almost mean the same thing. So again, I'd like to try to explore a little bit, the history of this term authoritarianism and how it's been used. So it's been used by many people, but among the people who most popularized the term were Karl Friedrich and Zbigniew Brzezinski. I'm not sure how to pronounce his first name. Are two key scholars who helped redefine authoritarianism in their influential work, Totalitarian Dictatorship and Autocracy from 1956. They outline the characteristics of authoritarian regimes and distinguish them from totalitarian ones. So in their view, authoritarianism refers to a political system in which a single leader or a small group holds significant power, but there's still some limited political pluralism, often with restrictions on political freedom and civil liberties. Notice here that how in this definition, though, it doesn't really refer at all to sort of the class characteristics of fascism. It is fundamentally a movement to, again, suppress working class resistance to capital. What you'll find more often than not in these sort of more academic understandings of authoritarianism and fascism, those things are almost completely stripped out of the context, which I think is important to keep in, basically. The term totalitarianism was widely popularized by Hannah Arendt in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism from 1951, where she analyzed the rise of totalitarian regimes like Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia. Arendt defined totalitarianism as a regime that seeks to control all aspects of public and private life, including the thoughts of individuals. Later, the term became used by academics to describe almost all left-wing or communist party-led regimes. For example, by Friedrich and Brzezinski, but also by Jean Kirkpatrick, for example, who became a very important foreign policy advisor in the Reagan administration. So the idea is that the United States might support authoritarian governments, but we don't support fascism or totalitarianism. And there's the idea that kind of emerges out of this. I'm sure advocates of these concepts would deny this is true, but it seems almost impossible to ignore that authoritarian regimes are like the less bad version. Totalitarianism is worse. Totalitarianism is left-wing. Authoritarianism is right-wing. But again, I think it serves a very important sort of Cold War political function here that kind of provides a kind of cover for the very brutal dictatorships that the United States would support during this period of time. So again, during the Cold War, the U.S. backed right-wing authoritarian regimes across the global South to contain communism, whether it's Latin America, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Africa, wherever. These governments use repression, censorship, and violence against leftist movements, often resembling fascist tactics, yet were typically labeled as authoritarian. So Kirkpatrick would argue that traditional authoritarian governments are less repressive than what she calls revolutionary autocracies, or would later just refer to as totalitarianism. So again, there's clearly an idea here that authoritarian governments, the kind of governments that the U.S. is supporting, are basically less bad than the governments that we are opposing, which are supposedly totalitarian, and also basically, again, associated with fascism. Now, Arendt also, I kind of glossed over this, but has also been criticized, for example, for sort of conflating Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union under Stalin. Here again, you sort of see the sort of class component of fascism completely drops out. I mean, the Soviet Union, whatever its problem was not sort of motivated by the same class interests that fascism was. It wasn't an attempt to crush working class resistance. These were regimes that usually came into power through working class resistance, or the proletariat and the peasantry in many cases. So that kind of, again, class component of these governments completely falls out of this, which I think is more than just an oversight on their part. So in this context, using the term authoritarian instead of fascist was a way to avoid the implications that these regimes might be ideologically aligned with fascism, but that they may pose a similar threat to liberal democracies. This allowed Western political elites, including figures like Brzezinski or Kirkpatrick, to justify their support for these regimes, framing them as bulwarks against communism rather than brutal repressive states that shared core traits with fascist movements. So what I'm basically arguing is that these so-called authoritarian governments should have more properly been called fascist, but for ideological reasons were avoided. They avoided doing that to basically pass them off as being less bad than other types of governments. I think it really comes down to something as simple as that. I have to confess, I've never quite understood the difference between authoritarianism and fascism. So to me, when you actually see how these regimes actually operate, they seem very much like fascist regimes. So I've never quite understood the conceptual, distinction between those two. And besides Kirkpatrick, who I said became a high-ranking official in the Reagan administration, Brzezinski too was an influential foreign policy elite and has been seemingly playing a role in some of the most horrible foreign policy choices made by the United States over the last 50 years. He was apparently one of the lead architects of the idea of arming the Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union, which later morphed into the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. He apparently played a big role in the plan to expand NATO eastward after the Cold War, which is a big part of the current war playing out between Russia and the Ukraine as well. So he's made a lot of horrible choices over the years. Yet, continues to be, considered an influential academic. He's no longer alive, but was, during his lifetime. So another theorist who helped develop this concept is Juan Linz, who again was one of the most influential contributions to the study of authoritarianism. In his 1964 essay, An Authoritarian Regime, Spain, Linz provided a comprehensive analysis of authoritarian regimes, emphasizing the idea that such regimes did not seek total control over all aspects of society, unlike totalitarian regimes. So here you have another influential American academic, later taught at Yale, who argues once again that authoritarian regimes are not as bad as totalitarian regimes. And just so happens to be the case that the authoritarian regimes are the countries basically supported by the United States, and the totalitarian regimes are the regimes opposed by the United States during the Cold War. Now, again, as this relates to Trump, if you're losing the thread here, I would argue that the people sometimes make the argument that, well, Trump is not a fascist, but he's an authoritarian. But I would argue that the difference between fascism and authoritarianism itself doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. That's kind of why I'm trying to explore this here. And again, I take this idea seriously. I do agree sometimes that the people, when people say that people throw the word fascism around to, often don't really have, an understanding of what they're talking about. So I'm trying to avoid that here by going through this. That's why I think it's somewhat necessary to go through this a little bit. So using Linz's framework, Francoist Spain, again, Linz was a Spanish sociologist before coming to the United States. Francoist Spain, a regime which lasted from 1939 to 1975, a contemporary, in other words, of Hitler and Mussolini, was often classified as authoritarian rather than fascist. So this would be a prime example of a brutal government that was not fascist, according to Linz and according to others, but was authoritarian. Franco's regime, they argue, while dictatorial and repressive, did not fully embrace the mass mobilization, violent ideological purification, or total control over society of fascist regimes like Mussolini's Italy or Hitler's Germany did. Franco's Spain, for instance, allowed some regional autonomy and limited pluralism, and it focused more on maintaining control and stability than enforcing an all-encompassing fascist ideology. So that's the argument that we're usually given. What is the difference between fascism and authoritarianism? The idea is that authoritarian governments don't try to mobilize the population as much as fascist governments do, and they're not as repressive, supposedly. But I would argue if you look closely at the history of Spain during this period of time, I mean, the distinctions between the two seem barely noticeable at all. Again, I'm quite confused by the idea that Spain under Franco was not, in all intents and purposes, basically a fascist regime. And that, this idea, well, I'll talk about this idea of mass mobilization more in a moment. But again, what here again falls out of the discussion here is, again, the class characteristics of the Francoist government and what they did. So, as in other fascist governments, Franco's government systematically destroyed or co-opted independent labor unions and left-wing political movements. So again, you see the same kind of repression of working class resistance that you would see under Hitler and Mussolini, and basically happened under other so-called authoritarian governments as well. So I mean, again, they're virtually identical in that regard, in that they severely repress working class resistance, which seems to be their true function. In particular, the nationalist trade unions, like the Vertical Syndicate, also known as the Vertical Trade Union, were created to serve the interests of the state and the employers, replacing the independent unions that had been active during the Second Spanish Republic. So again, you have no, independent workers' organizations that exist. Use of violence and coercion. Franco's regime maintained control through a combination of political violence, the imprisonment of political dissidents, and the suppression of strikes and protests. State-sanctioned violence was used against leftist groups, trade unions, and any labor-based uprisings was extremely common. This resembles the repressive elements seen in fascist regimes. Economic control. The regime worked closely with business elites. This is what people refer to as the kind of pluralism supposedly that existed under Franco. The pluralism basically was extended to business owners and the Catholic Church. Essentially, that's what they call pluralism here, restricting labor's influence over the economy while ensuring that large companies and industrialists had control over production. This was anti-working class because it kept labor in a subordinate position, unable to exercise significant economic or political power. Franco rose to power through a military coup aided by fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, repressed the working class, unions, leftist parties, and Catalan and Basque autonomy. These are different ethnic groups that exist within Spain, which still have conflicts to this very day. Again, maintained a rigid alliance with the Catholic Church and the landowning and business elite. Again, this is what passes for pluralism under Franco. Besides that, cultivated a cult of personality and rigid ideological conformity through censorship, indoctrination, and the Movimento Nacional, which is sort of a broad-based idea for Franco's approach to maintaining social control, essentially. So again, this is something that's supposedly lacking in authoritarian governments, in that they don't engage in this kind of cult of personality and rigid ideological control. But you certainly saw that in Franco's Spain. Here you see a military style celebration and parade with the U.S. President Gerald Ford. Franco's the little guy in the military uniform. This is in 1975. This is the year that he died. So by some accounts, I mean, Franco could actually be considered the most successful fascist leader, and that he lasted the longest. Hitler and Mussolini, of course, did not survive the 1940s. Franco lasted until the 1970s. Yet we kind of have forgotten about him for the most part. Now, here again, I think this picture shows, so this kind of celebration of militarism and nationalism is not all that distinct than what you would see under Mussolini's Italy or Hitler's Germany. Anyone's ever seen any kind of footage of this would see the parallels here. I think what this picture also reveals is, again, perhaps the true reason why we refer to governments like this as authoritarian, not fascist, is because here he is sitting here with the U.S. president. Now, how would that look to the American public if the American president was here with a acknowledged fascist leader? It wouldn't look good. So I think that's a big part of the reason why we kind of whitewash these fascist governments and refer to them as authoritarian. And therefore, again, the idea that Trump is not fascist, he's authoritarian, doesn't really make sense. Authoritarianism is basically fascism for the most part. At least that's what I'm trying to argue here. And again, here's a similar, again, militaristic style parade in the 1930s. You can see obviously people holding pictures of Franco. So again, this kind of cult of personality, mass mobilization thing, you certainly see in evidence in so-called authoritarian governments and other examples as well. Terms like authoritarianism, in other words, are not neutral. They were crafted and operationalized within a geopolitical context, often to obscure capitalist violence and de-politicize right-wing repression. The definition of fascism matters, in other words. If we use the liberal institutionalist definition, in other words, sort of academic definition of fascism, one focused on party structures, mass mobilization, and ideology, we leave out regimes that functionally serve the same repressive anti-worker purposes. Political science as a discipline participated in Cold War ideological production. By centering the concept of totalitarianism and strategically depoliticizing right-wing authoritarianism, it created a moral equivalence between leftist regimes like the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, while shielding US-backed counter-revolutionary violence. Again, the authoritarian governments are not as bad as these so-called left-wing governments in power in other parts of the world. So again, one of the crucial distinctions made between fascism and authoritarianism is this idea that the fascist governments rely on this notion of mass mobilization. So what I want to try to do is try to close the gap between these two things. So on the one hand, I've tried to show that, well, so-called authoritarian governments participated in these things, cult of personalities around a leader, military style parades and things like that. On the other hand, um, I would also argue that fascist governments tended to somewhat, exaggerate this idea, or the idea of mass mobilization as being a defining characteristic of fascism, somewhat exaggerated. Also, yes, it played a role as it did in authoritarian governments, but after a certain point, these governments tended to settle into a more sort of bureaucratic routine in many ways. The kind of mobilization of the masses was kind of tampered down past a certain point as well. So to that extent, I'm trying to again sort of close the gap to show you that what we call fascism and authoritarianism are actually not that different from each other. So again, in Mussolini's Italy, who was the first fascist leader, the term fascism basically comes from the political party that Mussolini founded. So in the early period where he first takes power in the early 1920s, emphasized street violence, mass rallies, and mobilization through the Fasci di Combattimento and the Black Shirts, his thugs, basically. Post 1925, after consolidating power, Mussolini's regime became more bureaucratic, less revolutionary, or Gramsci would say passive revolutionary, and more focused on state control and repression than continuous mobilization. He created a single party state, but everyday Italians were not constantly engaged in political mobilization. Much of society was passive, especially by the 1930s, which again is more characteristic of supposedly authoritarian regimes as well. If you remember also Sheldon Wallen's distinction between classical totalitarianism, what he calls inverted totalitarianism, shares this understanding as well. Wallen subscribes to the idea that classical totalitarian regimes relied on mass mobilization, whereas the inverted totalitarian state renders the population more passive. But again, in both Italy and Germany, you can see evidence of that too. After a certain point, they did try to render the people more passive early on. After a certain point. While Mussolini seized power quickly in 1922 through the March on Rome, he didn't fully consolidate dictatorial power until the mid 1920s. Between 1922 and 1926, he had to form coalitions with conservative elites, business owners, landowners, especially Italy being a very rural country at that point, pass enabling laws which would enable him to exercise more power, repress and absorb opposition parties, build ideological control over media, education, and culture. This is what Gramsci refers to as the war of position, basically, how it slowly consolidates power. Nazi Germany was in some regards more intensive in terms of mobilization than Italy through the Hitler Youth, the League of German Girls, massive rallies, parades, propaganda, the cult of personality around Hitler. Still, even here, worker or popular participation was often coerced or performed, not spontaneous. Many Germans were spectators, not active agents. Mobilization peaked in wartime when society was militarized and labor was conscripted. So, of course, Germany, when it was actually at war, a war for its own survival, basically, survival of the regime at least. Yes, of course, the kind of aggressive efforts to mobilize the population were deployed more, and early on when the regime was coming into power as well. But the sort of like middle period didn't always focus on mobilization as much. I would argue, maybe somewhat controversially here, but I mean, at certain points, the level of propaganda and mobilization of the Italian and German populace was probably not that much greater than what you'd see at an American sporting event or something like that. Where you engage in all this, especially now, especially after 9/11, where you have much more of an overt sort of militaristic display at the Super Bowl and things like that. Anyway, daily life for many Germans, especially non-Jews and non-leftists, was relatively normal. They went to work, raised families, and avoided political activity. So again, as long as you were compliant and didn't resist the regime, you led a fairly normal life during that period of time. From about 1933 or 34 to basically when the war started in 1939. The image of mass mobilization central to fascist myth-making, torchlight marches, stadium rallies, etc. But in practice, fascist regimes often demobilized independent civil society, especially unions and political parties, replacing with state-controlled organizations. Again, Gramsci's war of position. Much of the mobilization was top-down, ritualistic, and geared towards social discipline, not participatory uh, politics. So most of the participation was forced and coerced. These governments did have, yes, some degree of popular support, though, at certain points, not at all points. But if anything, that makes the case even worse for other so-called authoritarian governments that they didn't even have. The reason they were maybe less mobilized in some senses is they had even less popular support than Hitler and Mussolini had. But again, the important thing to keep in mind here is what role are they playing? They exist basically to repress the working class, to keep workers under control, basically, and to reestablish the power of capital. All right, so that concludes basically the first part. I maybe consider dividing this up into two different videos, but I'm just going to keep it one. So this will be the logical place to take a break now, pause the video, get a drink, go to the bathroom, do what you have to do. Now I'm going to give a little bit more of an overview of the executive branch, and then sort of segue into this idea of presidential cycles. Okay, ready? So basically, the power of the executive branch has grown significantly since 1789, right? In its founding, it was relatively small. The presidential cabinet was very small, made up of basically 5 permanent offices or departments, one of which was the postmaster general, which has since been downgraded here. You can see here's the current day presidential cabinet, or actually a list of the presidential or the executive departments, not even a full list of the presidential cabinet, which is even more extensive. Here you have a bigger breakdown of the executive branch highlighted here in yellow. And I know this is hard to read. I mean, the point here isn't actually really to read it. It just kind of speaks to the massive scale and size of the executive branch. The government bureaucracy has grown to since its founding, of course. Now, where did this expansion of power take place? Well, to some extent, it occurred incrementally through various presidential administrations. Grew a lot under Lincoln, for example, during the Civil War. But FDR is almost always referred to as the first modern president, although even the executive branch has grown significantly since he has been in office. But FDR is really the first president to kind of wield the kind of power and to perform the kind of functions that we tend to associate with the modern day executive branch, especially in the idea of providing administration, overseeing a kind of social welfare state, social spending in the United States, as well as, of course, the increased wartime powers of the president, as well as during this period of time, the U.S. basically becomes the global empire that it now is. So moving now to this idea of presidential cycles, right? We've covered the readings by Stephen Skowronek, who kind of coins the term, particularly in his book, The Politics Presidents Make. So in Skowronek's view, there have been at least 5 presidential cycles, beginning with Jefferson. Washington and Adams was too brief, basically, to really constitute a full cycle. But beginning with Thomas Jefferson, who was the 3rd president of the United States, there have been basically 5 presidential cycles. The Jeffersonians, the Jacksonians, the Republicans, the New Deal, and the Reagan era. Now, Skowronek in his later work holds open the possibility that with the election of Barack Obama in 2008, that maybe we were coming to the end of the Reagan cycle. I can say with all confidence, though, that did not happen. Even under Biden, I would argue that we are still very much within the Reagan cycle, if you understand what that means, which I'll turn to in a moment. He also talks about the different roles that presidents play. There's a president that sort of begins the cycle, the presidents that strengthen the cycle, and then there's ultimately the president that ends the cycle. That's fairly obvious, though, I think. Crucially, now this is an important thing to keep in mind as well, is that the idea of presidential cycles is, in a sense, bipartisan, and that it encompasses both political parties. So, for example, the New Deal, which begins under Franklin Roosevelt, of course, lasts basically until Ronald Reagan, encompasses Republican presidents as well. FDR was a Democrat, but Republican presidents during this period of time also fall within the New Deal cycle, and that there's sort of a continuity of uh, uh, policies which define the cycle. Even if the Republicans moderated in some way, there's still a larger continuity with the policies of the New Deal, just as there is with the Reagan cycle continuity with Democratic presidents during this period of time as well. And the New Deal and the Reagan cycle are in many ways almost like the inverse of each other. But again, I'll explain that a little bit more when I get to them. I'll mostly talk about the New Deal and the Reagan cycle. I'm going to skip the first two, talk a little bit about the Republican cycle, which begins with Abraham Lincoln, the first Republican president, the first president to come out of the Republican Party, which did not exist prior to the 1850s. A lot of people don't realize that. They think the Republican Party always existed or goes back to the origins of the Republic. It does not, actually. And this cycle lasts a pretty long time. Basically lasts from about 1860. I mean, if you date it from the election year, 1860 to 1932. So almost 75 years. Very long period of time. Of course, the Lincoln years was characterized by the Civil War. You see here a map of Lincoln's re-election in 1864, while the war was still going on. Now, what was interesting about this is that, one, they decided to still continue with the presidential election during the war, which you could have argued because of the war they had to suspend the presidential election. But Lincoln, I would say maybe to his credit, still stood for election in 1864. And I think the other thing that stands out about this is that there's unequivocal support from the vast majority of the country for the objectives of the Civil War, which at this point, by 1864, it was becoming quite clear that the war was being fought to end slavery in the United States. You can see many states did not participate in the election, which is interesting to think of the presidential election occurring where a large group of states do not participate in the election, but of the remaining states, overwhelmingly voted in favor of Lincoln and in favor of the Northern cause during that point in time. Now, you could argue, well, the only states left were the North, which is true, but you can see that there were, borderline states in there as well. You could also argue that if the country as a whole, or what would remain of the country, was becoming exhausted by the war, and the devastation caused by the war, the death toll by the war, that they would have been willing to sort of, bring the war to an end, which is essentially what the opposition was offering at that point in time. So I think it's worth mentioning that, yes, there was strong support for the war by this point in time, strong support for basically ending slavery at this point in time. Now, the soldiers who voted in the war, I think about 80% of them voted for Lincoln as well. And of course, after the war, you have the Reconstruction era, which I'll only give a little bit of attention to, because there are so many other things to talk about. But Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, who's written about this and who I've already quoted a few times in previous classes, has a lot of interesting things to say about it. So one of the major things that stands out about the Reconstruction era was the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau, a government agency which was tasked with basically facilitating the end of slavery and the protection of civil rights for the newly freed slaves, which were referred to as freedmen at that time. So Du Bois writes, the Secretary of War was to issue necessary provisions, clothing, and fuel, and under the direction of the president, the commissioner could set aside for freedmen and refugees tracts of lands not more than 40 acres. If you heard the expression 40 acres and a mule, that's where it comes from, to be leased to tenants. The leasees were to be protected in the use of land for 3 years at a low rent. At the end of the term, the tenant could purchase the land at an appraised value. So this was in many ways, a redistribution of land, which is funny because it's kind of characteristic of what you see when you have a proletarian revolution in these countries, whether it's Russia or China or wherever. Land redistribution is a significant part of that. You see the establishment of schools during this point in time to give an education to the freed slaves. Du Bois writes it was a dictatorship. What the North imposed upon the South during the Reconstruction era was a dictatorship, but a dictatorship backed by the military arm of the United States, by which the governments of the southern states were to be coerced into accepting a new form of administration in which the freed men and the poor whites were to hold the overwhelming balance of, of, of political power. So he wants to shift the balance of political power in the state away from the plantation owners into the hands of the freedmen and the poor whites. Quite an ambitious experiment, one which failed ultimately. But it's noteworthy, of course, that something like this was ever even attempted in the first place. Du Bois continues. He says the difficulty was with this theory was the failure to realize that such dictatorship must last long enough to really put the mass of workers in power, that this would be, in fact, a dictatorship of the proletariat, which must endure until the proletariat, or at least a leading united group with clear objects and effective method, had education and experience and had taken firm control of the economic organization of the South. Unfortunately, the power set to begin this dictatorship was the military arm of the government, which more and more was falling to the hands of organized wealth, and of wealth organized on a scale never before seen in modern civilization. So it's interesting that Du Bois compares the idea of Reconstruction to the dictatorship of the proletariat. In fact, Du Bois writes elsewhere that Reconstruction, he says, is the most sort of ambitious experiment in Marxism until the Russian Revolution. Quite a strange thing to think about, if we pause and hear, to think that the Republican Party was carrying out an experiment in Marxism. And of course, it ultimately didn't succeed. But even that, like I said just a moment ago, the fact that something like that would even be attempted is quite extraordinary, I think. But what happens? The Republican Party basically becomes, what we know it as today, the party of big, the party of big business, basically. Which, of course, these contradictions always existed in the Republican Party, which, like I said, did not have a very particularly long life prior to the Civil War and the Reconstruction era. But by the late 1870s, if we see these as conflicting tendencies within the Republican Party, an abolitionist tendency verging on Marxism, according to Du Bois, and the big business tendency, it's quite clear that by the 1880s or so, that the big business tendency had basically won out and become dominant, which it would be, to this very day. Although, to be fair, there were still, even afterwards, progressive elements within the Republican Party as well. Theodore Roosevelt was considered to be a progressive, and there were other so-called progressive Republicans as well. I should remind people that, the City University of New York was basically created by a Republican governor, Nelson Rockefeller, of the famous Rockefeller family. I mean, could you imagine a Republican governor doing something like that now, creating public colleges? You can barely get Democratic administrations to fund already existing colleges, let alone create new ones. So that kind of tells you a lot of how politics has changed over time in this country. So now we turn to the New Deal, the so-called New Deal cycle. And one person to write about the New Deal and has a lot of things to say about it is Ira Katznelson in this book, In Fear Itself, the New Deal and the Origins of Our Time. So what Katznelson argues is that Southern Democrats were essential to the New Deal, but also, limited what the New Deal was capable of in many ways. So when we talk about the New Deal, we, of course, are talking about basically for the first time the creation of a welfare state in this country, the creation of a government, of a federal government, which would intervene directly in providing, forms of economic assistance to people, regulating capital, as well as, supporting the formation of unions in the United States as well. However, is not, support which was not limited or conditional in many ways. And again, if you look at the political base of support that Roosevelt had, he had to rely a lot on Southern Democrats who were coming out of the segregated South. So Katznelson argues the Southern Democrats were essential to the New Deal's experimental economic planning, and of course, leading U.S. Preparations for World War II before Pearl Harbor. However, at the same time, they enforced white supremacy, limiting the egalitarian potential of the welfare state. In other words, African Americans were mostly excluded from the New Deal programs. Created what he calls a Southern cage that shaped the American state. It was weak in regulating capital, strong and violent abroad. So Katznelson sort of traces these aspects to this sort of, perhaps oversized influence that the Southern Democrats had in the United States during this period of time. He says there's sort of an irony to it as well. Despite their initial support, the South's own creation backfired on them. World War II mobilization empowered Black veterans and labor activists. Legal precedents against New Deal power became tools for civil rights litigation. Still, the state was structurally limited. It could not resist residential segregation, economic inequality, or mass incarceration. Civil rights progress occurred within Cold War constraints. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we turn to the history of the civil rights movement. So why the New Deal? Why was the New Deal characterized by this so-called experimental economic planning? Again, the creation of the welfare state. Of course, you can't really understand that without understanding the backdrop of the Great Depression, right? Which was the most significant challenge since the Civil War, politically speaking, and the worst economic downturn in American history, at least so far. Depression was a worldwide phenomenon as well, though triggered in the U.S. after the stock market crash in 1929. The Depression contributed to the rise of Hitler in Germany, who actually takes power the same year Franklin Roosevelt becomes president of the United States in 1933, and even helped Stalin consolidate power in the Soviet Union. So there are tensions in Katznelson's argument. The book tends to equivocate a lot. In other words, Katznelson at some point seems to warn of the threat of dictatorship in the United States, brought on by the economic pressures of the Great Depression, but also says the U.S. is never truly at risk of fascism or communism. Despite ominous comparisons referencing Arendt and totalitarianism, Katznelson notes there was no real equivalent to Nazi Germany's Enabling Act. U.S. institutions remain democratic, with Congress and the courts active. So Congress and the courts continue to play kind of a restraining role on the growth of executive power. Strong executive action, he says, was approved democratically, not imposed dictatorial. Jeremy Kessler, who writes a review of Katznelson's book, emphasizes that despite Katznelson's dramatic framing, the U.S. was, again, not at risk of dictatorship or revolution. He writes, as generations of American historians have concluded, neither fascism nor communism was in the cards for the United States. Most tellingly, Kessler goes on to write, Fear itself provides no sustained analysis of what dictatorship in the United States might have looked like. In other words, if dictatorship happened in the United States, what would it have looked like? It wouldn't have exactly resembled fascism in Italy or Nazism in Germany. That might be an oversight in Katznelson's book, but it's not hard to imagine what it would have looked like. In fact, Sheldon Wallen, I would argue, does provide such an analysis in his book, Democracy Incorporated. Basically resembles the kind of inverted totalitarianism that he talks about there. Still, the influence of the Communist Party, the Socialist Party, and the Socialist Workers' Party were never stronger than they were in the 1930s and played a significant role in the struggle for unionization. Fascism also had strong appeal among American business elites and corporations, including Texaco, United Banking Corporation, IBM, GM, Ford, Coca-Cola, and the Associated Press. Narratives like Katznelson, also shared by Kessler, also downplay the significant violence and repression of socialism in the United States. So I kind of want to push back a little bit about what they're saying here. Basically, what they're saying is that, no, don't worry, the United States was still stable. There's never really a chance that either fascism or communism could happen in the United States. And uh, leaving fascism aside, I mean, again, it did have pretty strong appeal among American uh, business elites. There was even a kind of an attempted coup against FDR in the early 1930s by fascists, or business elites that want to create a kind of fascist state in the United States. I want to push back against this idea that socialism or communism never had any kind of chance in the United States, and that might be true. But is it true because Americans are just not interested in socialism, which seems to be sort of the dominant view of historians that are referenced here? Or is it because of the significant violence and repression of socialism in the United States? I would argue it has a lot more to do with the latter. And in fact, there was significant struggle on the part of people during this period of time, especially in the 1930s and 1940s. And you have to sort of take that in mind, or keep that in mind as well. So first of all, as I've already kind of referenced, I mean, there was significant repression of socialists. The United States had the most violent labor struggles, basically, of any country in the world. And just a partial list of some of these things include, the Red Scare of 1919 and 1920 after World War I, the Palmer raids, violent crackdowns on labor movements, the Haymarket massacre, the Pullman strike, the Homestead strike, the deportation of radicals, for example, Emma Goldman, or the defendants in the Abrams case, which I've talked about in the article I wrote. FBI infiltration and harassment of socialist and black radical movements, COINTELPRO, the assassinations of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Fred Hampton, the Socialist Workers Party, infiltration of the assassinations of MLK, Malcolm X, Fred Hampton. I mean, Fred Hampton, I think, has been conclusively, proven that was a part of COINTEL, this FBI program to undermine socialist and black radical movements. MLK, Malcolm X is still debatable, but I mean, certainly a lot of signs seem to point towards something like that. Anti-communist purges during McCarthyism, which destroyed the careers of many people and destroyed labor movements in the United States as well. In many ways, the United States never, the left in the United States never fully recovered from McCarthyism, as well as the continuing and ongoing systematic exclusion of socialist voices from media and electoral systems. Other than people have a very sort of watered down, sort of weak version of socialism, which usually aligns with the Democratic Party. So you can't really understand the lack of socialism in the United States without these things, to a large extent. To just kind of complacently argue, well, the United States could never have socialism. I mean, you have to really go further and try to argue why. Yes, we don't have socialism in the United States, but is it because the Americans are just not interested in it, or because they've never really been given the choice? And to the extent that people have tried to organize or tried to build a socialist movement in the United States, they've literally been killed in many cases and repressed in other ways as well. Now, to be fair, let's take a look at it in a materialist fashion, historically grounded, materialist way, and try to understand the arguments for that. So one of the reasons given for why the United States could never have socialism was the strength of the U.S. capitalist class, which by the early 20th century was well-resourced, very rich and powerful, obviously, politically coherent, organized, in other words, and violently repressive as well, like I've already covered. But like all capitalist classes, they are the minority, right? They represent a very small portion of the population, yet they continue to have this sort of disproportional influence over politics in the country as well. The weaknesses of the U.S. working class movement, including racial and ethnic divisions deliberately fostered by elites. That's probably the most important factor here. The United States, unlike other countries, which are much more, which don't have those levels of racial divisions, we're better able to form socialist movements. The United States, because you pit black against white and other groups in society, have never been able to fully unify and organize in a way that they represented a significant threat to capitalist interest. It's a sad but true reality I think a lot of people have to accept. But were those things? Was it always that way? Were there moments where these things looked like they were being overcome? Yeah, there are moments here and there as well. There's a lack of a unified socialist party, like in parts of Europe. So again, I mentioned, during the 1930s, you had actually three socialist parties: the Socialist Party, the Communist Party, and the Socialist Workers' Party. But during the 1930s, they were somewhat organized, somewhat on the same page. You didn't have one big socialist party in the United States, but in European countries, which have gone further in some regards towards socialism or social democracy, you also have that. You have socialist parties, you have communist party, So I don't know if that necessarily is the best argument that you can make either. I think more importantly, again, the electoral system and the state structure that made third party breakthroughs difficult. So our political institutions are basically, and our elections particularly, are designed in a way to make it almost impossible for a party outside the two-party duopoly to have significant power. Now that's true, but again, there are exceptions to that as well. First of all, I mean, it's interesting to consider how close somebody like Henry Wallace came to becoming president of the United States, who was a socialist, if you've never heard of him before. But he was actually, so Oliver Stone actually covers this in a documentary series he did called The Untold History of the United States, working with the historian Peter Kuznick. And in one episode, they devote almost entire episodes to talking about Wallace's ouster as vice president of the United States, as the nominee for vice president. So Wallace, who was a socialist, was actually FDR's vice president in 1940, but was basically thrown out in favor of Harry Truman in 1944. Why this is significant, obviously, is that Roosevelt dies in 1945 and Harry Truman becomes president in 1945. Now, things have gone differently. Wallace would have become president in 1945. So think how close he was, or how close the United States was to basically having a socialist as president of the United States. So this idea that it's an insurmountable barrier, I mean, obviously it did not happen, but is it an unbeatable structure? I mean, I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of contingent circumstances that have to be taken into account here. And that's the reason why Stone focuses on it so closely. It seems as if Wallace was very close to becoming the vice presidential nominee in 1944 as well. Had just a few things gone differently, you would have had a drastically different outcome. Besides that, while our political system does make it very hard for socialists to wield power at the federal level, at state and local government, you actually do have a pretty good, history of socialist officials, even to this very day, in fact. There's people who claim to be socialist. Again, we'll talk about that a little bit more in future class. Another thing is that you have more recent innovations, like ranked choice voting, for example, to make the system a little more open and democratic. Like Mamdani, for example, becoming the mayoral candidate through ranked choice voting, which basically allows you to vote for more than one candidate. That actually significantly improves the chances of outsider candidates to win. So I'm a big, proponent of that. I mean, we should do things to make the political system more open, more democratic. We have to change the institutions themselves to allow for these things to happen. But that's the thing. There have been plenty of examples of these kinds of reforms to the political system that have been made. So yes, it's very hard, but it's not necessarily impossible either. People like Katznelson and Kessler, who again argue that socialism never had a chance in the United States, also speak often of the sort of liberal democratic ideology in the United States. That Americans had this belief that they were this exceptional country, strong belief in individualism, which we've talked about with Tocqueville, for example, strong current within American culture, middle class identity as well. People are kind of comfortable and complacent in their middle class lifestyle, and would thus be turned off to socialism. However, this seems to me an odd argument to make in the context of the of the 1930s when all these things were basically being undermined during this period of time. It's almost as if they're sort of projecting the attitudes of the 1950s after World War II, when, yes, this post-war prosperity was shared by more people in this country, though not African Americans for the most part, but by most white Americans. They're almost, projecting that mentality backwards into the 1930s and 1940s. People weren't comfortable in their middle class identity in the 1930s. They were going through the Great Depression back then. So all those things were significantly undermined during that period of time. Yes, I mean, after World War II, the chance of that, significantly closed. But we're talking about the 1930s and the 1940s, the pivotal moment here. And I would argue those things weren't necessarily as strong as they were back then. Again, you can't project people's attitudes 20 years later during a period of prosperity and assume that people felt the same way during a period of severe economic depression. And there's also the geographical and imperial position of the United States. The United States is a dominant empire, so it's able to sort of exploit the rest of the world and deliver spoils to its populace to keep them, again, complacent. The United States is also separated by two large oceans. It's remote from, the Soviet Union. Some people argue that that's another reason why socialism had more success in European countries, because of its closeness to the Soviet Union. Again, immense natural resources. Yes, I mean, yes, it is true the U.S. had all that, but again, that still did not save it from the Great Depression either. Yes, the U.S. has had all this resources and this abundance of land and everything else, but it still didn't, prevent the economy from going through this massive depression in the 1930s. And even the idea that America was this empire that could distribute its spoils. Once again, that happens after World War II. Not before, not in the 1930s necessarily. Yes, the U.S. coming out of World War I was already, a creditor to the rest of the world. Other countries owed all this money to the United States, but the United States also had problems collecting that money. And anyway, its imperial power was, nothing compared to what it was after World War II. So once again, it seems like people are projecting the attitudes of people in the 1950s and the 1960s back into the 1930s and 1940s, which I think is kind of an odd argument. So yes, while you would have to concede some things, I still think this rigid narrative, the idea that you could never have socialism in the United States, overlooks a lot of the contingent circumstances that occurred. There are a lot of things, and even taking a closer look than what I've laid out here, if you look closely at American history, I think there's lots of evidence to suggest that things possibly could have gone a different way. And it's important to sort of, as they say, brush history against the grain, sort of go against the grain of the dominant historical narratives. So the German literary critic and philosopher Walter Benjamin, or in German, Walter Benjamin, writes, "The consciousness of exploding the continuum of history is peculiar to the revolutionary classes in the moment of their action." And what he's saying here basically is that revolutionaries don't just fight for a better future, they also challenge the dominant version of the past. In their moment of action, they refuse to accept that history has naturally led to the present. They expose the ruptures, violence, and injustice that the official history has smoothed over or forgotten. So you have to sort of blow those moments out of the past, sort of explode the sort of dominant narrative of the past and reveal the historical struggles that have taken place before. Unfortunately, people like Katz Nelson and Kessler tend to be more akin to smoothing over these things and sort of, justifying the dominant narrative, even appealing to authority, as Kessler says, well, all these historians say it, so it must be true. Again, I think you have to look, closer at that and sort of bring to light the past, struggles that have already gone before. Benjamin, as would happen, was also, a victim of fascism as well, by the way. So Roosevelt's New Deal proves popular. Even before he gets into office, this is 1932, wins a landslide victory over Hoover, wins even more decisively in 1936. We go on to win elections in 1940, 1944. I don't have all the maps here, but you get the sense of it. This establishes the New Deal, which lasts basically for the next almost 50 years, and even Republican presidents during this period of time, Eisenhower and even Nixon, more or less govern according to it. They moderate some aspects of it, but they do not seek to overturn or significantly turn back the welfare state and things like that. In fact, the welfare state begins to strengthen even more in the 1960s under Lyndon Johnson, who also wins decisively in 1964 as well. But that all came to an end essentially in the 1980s. And I think more or less brings us up to where we are now when Ronald Reagan becomes president in 1980. So Reagan is known for the famous phrase, government is the problem. In other words, the welfare state has grown too big in this country. It's time to cut it back. Cuts taxes significantly. Trump, of course, continues to cut taxes. So whereas the New Deal was about progressive taxation, raising taxes on wealthy people, increasing social spending, again, the Reagan cycle is sort of the opposite of that. Cutting taxes, cutting back on social spending. Not cutting military spending, mind you, that continues to go up, as well as the government debt as well. Well, social welfare spending gets cut back. Also crushes workers' resistance. Famously, the air traffic controller strike early in his presidential term, which basically signals, an attack on organized labor in this country. Unions oftentimes being complicit in this as well, not fighting very hard, accepting these, low substandard contracts and things like that. Democratic Party under Clinton and future Democratic presidents basically embrace many of these ideas as well. And again, we're still pretty much here now. Low taxes on the wealthy, cutbacks to social spending. Nothing has really changed in a significant way. I often refer to this as the secret chapter of American history because I'm not being completely serious here. I mean, obviously, many people are aware of this, particularly people that follow politics. But in the sort of textbook version of American history that students often get, I wonder how much this is actually acknowledged. In other words, everybody basically agrees, whether you like it or not, that the period from the 1930s, basically up until the 1980s, was a period of profound social change in this country. The United States was becoming a more liberal country in many aspects, or in most aspects, whether you like it or not. Some people hate the idea, but they at least acknowledge it. I wonder if it's as widely acknowledged that the period basically since the 1980s has been essentially a backlash against all that. And the United States has become much more of a conservative country, much more of even a reactionary country. I mean, the true meaning of the term reactionary, term that's often misunderstood by people, means to essentially go back to a prior status quo. In theory, conservatives are not against change, right? They just want to change things a little more slowly than liberals do. At least that's what we're taught to understand. So in the true sense of the term, I mean, today's conservatives are not really conservative. They are reactionaries. They want to go back prior to the New Deal. They want to go, whether it's the 1920s, the 1890s, whatever it is. And I don't know if that's not as often acknowledged, that basically reactionaries have controlled the country, essentially since the 1980s. I see Reagan, much like FDR, wins, decisively in 1980, and then again in 1984 as well. Now, what happens during this period of time as well? Well, even preceding Reagan, is that the rate of profit in the U.S. economy, as studied by Marxist economists, begins to go down. You can see it's sort of high point coming out of World War II, and it's gradually declined since then. With some cyclical turns, but the overall secular trend, as they say, has been for the rate of profit to lower in the economy. Now, this is a crucial context for understanding the election of Ronald Reagan, and really a big part of American politics, the most important aspects of American politics since then. what are the consequences of this? Falling profitability in the U.S. economy, increased economic instability, more frequent crises and recessions as profits fall, which certainly have happened since the 1970s. So the rate of profit begins to lower, but reaching sort of a crisis point by the 1970s, and then arguably the rate of profit begins to increase again after Ronald Reagan, but then seems to be falling again since then. There's a lot of debate actually over the true movements of the rate of profit in the U.S. economy, even among Marxist economists. But that's another discussion. But assuming that the rate of profit is falling, you have increased economic instability, lower investment, and slower economic growth. All these things, of course, are true. You can argue about the rate of profit, but all the so-called consequences of it are undoubtedly true. Stagnant or declining wages, pressure on corporations to cut costs, financialization, which we've already talked about, widening income and wealth inequality, as well as lower tax revenues as well. So one of the reasons why maybe the government has to cut back on social welfare spending is because of the fall in the profit rates. We also, a big part of the reason why we have such, basically crappy infrastructure in the country as well. There's simply not enough profits being generated in the economy anymore to fund all these things. So in one sense, the consequences of the Reagan administration are not necessarily a choice made by politicians, but sort of imperatives imposed upon politics in this country by the economic conditions of society. Now, as I mentioned, a lot of Marxist economists, debate this idea. Some argue that the rate of profit is not actually falling. It all depends on how you measure it. I'm not so interested in going into that debate here, but I would say that among Marxist economists who argue that the rate of profit is not falling or has climbed basically since the 1980s, the reason why it's climbing are basically because of all the same things. In other words, they have to impose stagnant wages. They have to cut back on social welfare spending. They've moved away from industry into finance as a way to restore the profit rate. So either the rate of profit is actually falling in spite of these things, or the rate of profit is only staying high because of all these, essentially horrible things that have to be imposed on the American population. Not to mention, increased imperialism abroad as well. Trying to literally drain the value produced by other countries and siphon it off into the United States. That's a big debate. I'm not so interested in having that debate here. But again, the consequences seem to be the same no matter what. So either the falling profitability is causing these things to happen, or the profit rate is only being offset. The fall in the profit rate is only being offset because of these same things too. So either way, the consequences are kind of the same. Important thing to keep in mind. Now, I would argue that maybe the idea of the falling rate of profit makes a little bit more sense, because in spite of the clear consequences of these things happening, financialization, the idea that these wealthy elites are just hoarding all of the wealth and won't share it with workers. Now there seem to be increasingly severe social consequences associated with that. So if they had more to share, why aren't they? Well, if the profit rate was actually just kind of falling, then they really can't. Literally, if they shared more with workers, it would cause the profit rate to fall even more. So are they just that greedy that they just refuse to redistribute wealth to workers, even though the consequences of not doing so are becoming increasingly apparent, or are they just simply not able to? And this is Marx argued that the law of the tendency of the profit rate to fall. That's a confusing term. So it's both a law but also a tendency. Another confusing terminology here. But what Marx is saying is that there's a strong tendency for the rate of profit to fall unless certain things happen to basically prop it back up. But if you don't do those things, then the rate of profit will fall. And even if you do so, eventually those things will kind of exhaust themselves anyway. Marx considers this to be the most important law of what he called political economy. And it's basically his best argument for why you essentially can't reform the capitalist system. Because if you do so, if you try to redistribute more wealth to workers, again, it will cause the profit rate to fall, which will bring on a crash. So the only thing that you can do is to essentially, sort of break out of the confines of the confines of the system. And I think that's another reason why I'm maybe more inclined to accept that view. People who argue no, the rate of profit's actually rising or high, also tend to accept this idea that, well, you can't change the system, so all you can try to do is reform it. Again, it's a complicated argument, but I think it's important to keep in mind what the consequences of this are, whether the profit rate is falling or not. Again, if it's not falling, it's only because you can pretty much see the same consequences as if the profit rate was actually falling, which is not good for us, basically. And I'll start to wrap things up here. I know I've been talking for a while. Again, if you look at future Democratic presidents like Clinton's big five achievements, all extremely conservative: NAFTA, welfare reform, the crime bill, deregulating finance, deregulating the media. I have a more of a detailed breakdown of this here. I know it's a lot to read. This is for your own reference if you ever want to look at it at a future point. I'm not going to cover it too much here, but you can see it's all there. Welfare reform, kicking millions of people off the welfare rolls, the mass incarceration state, deregulating finance, deregulating the media, like I said. Now, the last three slides I have, I'm actually making it through this massive slideshow, are the last three presidential elections. And I just want to look at people to, notice the change in states among the last three elections here in terms of red and blue. You can also see that since 2020, some of the electoral votes of the states have changed. I'm not so interested in that. But you see, when Trump wins in 2016 and again in 2024, I want you to keep in mind which states he's winning. So you can see a big part of the country is just almost like permanently red and blue. There's very little change, actually, from election to election. This is 2016. Let's look at 2020. This is like, you look at it real quick and then look away, and I can give you like a quiz on it. Which states changed between 2016 and 2020? And in fact, a few states I want to particularly focus on. So you can see in 2024 and in 2020, well, actually in 2024, Trump wins Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, and these Midwestern states. And I want to particularly focus on those states, again, because these are the states that have been particularly impacted by deindustrialization, the outsourcing of jobs overseas, again, as corporations are pressured to cut costs. So you can see in 2016, Clinton wins Nevada. But in 2024, Trump actually won Nevada as well. Besides this, he wins Arizona and Georgia, which he also won in 2016. But let's focus on these key states here. Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Trump wins those in 2024. Biden wins them in 2020. Trump wins them again in 2016, along with Ohio and Indiana as well. Now, again, these three states comprise a significant part of the industrial heartland, as people used to call it, of the United States, now referred to as the Rust Belt of the United States. And again, it's quite clear that the inability to, make improvements among the working class population of these states is probably a big part of the reason why Trump has had success in these states. Clinton, who I mentioned a moment ago, one of his so-called big achievements was passing NAFTA, is hated by workers in many of these states. And, not surprisingly, Hillary Clinton lost those states in 2016. So again, I would also add to that, again, if people are so concerned about the rise of Trump, if even liberal elites are so concerned about the rise of Trump, it would seem to be, one logical thing that you could do to prevent the rise of this kind of right-wing authoritarianism, which I've argued is pretty much indistinguishable from fascism, despite people's attempts to try to separate the two, would be to redistribute more income to workers so that they'd be less susceptible to these ideas. But they refuse to. So why? Are they just that greedy and stupid? Or is it because they really can't? And I think you have to start entertaining the possibility that maybe they just can't. There's just not enough, again, profit being generated in the economy. I know it seems like a hard thing to imagine when you hear about the fantastic wealth accumulated by these billionaires and stuff. But that's not an indication of the economy as a whole. All right, I mean, the GDP of the United States is measured in terms of tens of trillions of dollars. So even the wealth of a billionaire is kind of inconsequential compared to that. And when you look at the economy as a whole, you get a picture of declining profitability, or a declining rate of profit. So a percentage of profit that's generated in the economy every year. And as that profit rate shrinks more and more and more, you have an increased tendency, a likelihood of significant crises to happen, which of course then empowers leaders like Trump, who try to exploit that kind of insecurity and weakness that people feel. So again, one logical solution would be, well, I mean, just like FDR said in the 1930s, look, you got to give up a little bit of your wealth to prevent workers from becoming more radicalized in this country. And they did. He did convince them to do that, more or less. Some had to be, kind of coerced into it also. Now it seems like the attitude of the capitalist class is, nah, we're not going to do that. We're just going to try fascism instead. Rather than redistribute wealth, diffuse some of the tension built up among the working class, now we're just going to, continue to hoard all this wealth and crush them if they resist us. That's one way of looking at it. Or, like I said, they just are not able to, and so realize, well, we can't redistribute any wealth to the workers, so we have to crush them anyway. Either way, the future looks rather bleak as long as we stay on this current path. I'm still optimistic of the idea that there's possibly some way to it is still possible some way to sort of break out of this path. It's going to take significant action on the part of people. People are going to have to get organized and active in ways that they never have before, really, even exceeding what people did in the 1930s. All right, so I will bring things to a close here. So take care, everyone.